Hello again, Little Masters, and welcome to the Prancing Pony Podcast.
West to Howl, my friends. I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and as always, I'm here with the man of the West, the Aragorn to my Aemir, Alan Sisto. Today we'll be looking at Chapter 6 of the Quenta Silmarillion of Fëanor and the Unchaining of Melkor.
Something bad's going to happen in this episode, isn't it?
Probably at least one bad thing will happen. Yeah.
Well, first off, it's kind of hard to believe we're already at chapter number 6, but we're going to finally get a chance to meet the eldest son of Finwë, the famous Fëanor, greatest craftsman of the Noldor who ever lived, and we'll see Melkor get up to some of his old tricks.
Yeah, and I think this will be an interesting one. Fëanor is a complex character, to say the least, and he generally generates a lot of discussion,
Yes, he
certainly
does.
in the kind of places we hang out. But
We hang out in some boring places, apparently.
he is a major player in the events of Middle-earth. Very important stuff going on in this chapter, and we'll talk about him.
At length. In fact, I should warn you, this looks like it might be a really long one. I thought it was going to be short, but I have a feeling that this is going to be a full-length episode, let's put it that way. We'll keep an eye on the clock, and folks, if we have to break it up into two, we'll do that. But before we get into the discussion, let's see if old Barley has anything in his bag for us.
Okay,
Sean?
well, I've got one from him right here. Actually, it's not a question today that I want to address, but I do want to start with a comment that we got from one of our listeners who came to us and commented on Facebook.
Oh, okay.
So after listening to our episode on Chapter 3...
Which just a reminder, anybody can do that.
That's
Just follow
right.
us on Facebook and
That's
put
right.
a comment up there.
That's right, or Twitter, or any of the social medias. But after listening to our episode on Chapter 3, which was the coming of the elves and the captivity of Melkor, our listener Maria in Serbia had this to say. She said, "Wonderful as always." Thank you, Maria.
Well, there goes your credibility right out the window.
She went
As
on
always.
to say, yeah, she went on to say this, and I love this. She says, "I always felt that the Valar treated the elves kind of like pets. Not that I blame them for that. If you happen to be a crazy cat person or a dog person or something, you may feel sorry for an animal living in the street exposed to the elements, likely to get run over by a car. And you provide it with all the love and comfort. Well, sometimes it happens that your pet prefers to go back and enjoy its freedom. Sometimes it's overjoyed to stay with you for the rest of your lives. That was the difference," she says, "between the Noldor and the Vanyar. In any case, I can't blame the Valar for wanting them near."
Who's the dog here? Who's the dog? Harry, who's the dog? Sorry. That's all I could think of.
I'm not sure I'm getting that reference. I think
Harry Met Sally. When Harry Met Sally, I don't remember the exact one. I just remember he's giving her some bad analogy about dogs, and I don't remember it at all. I just remember her saying, "Who's the dog here, Harry?"
That's a good one.
So,
I haven't seen that movie in quite a while.
A decade or more for me.
Yeah.
Oh goodness.
But
which one is the dog? I mean, are the dogs
probably the Vanyar?
The Vanyar must be the dogs,
because they're the
Noldor
one
or the cats.
And
yeah.
I say this as a cat person. I have 2 cats at home and no dogs.
You're a cat person?
I am a cat person.
We're gonna have to. I'm so sorry. After 13 episodes, folks, this podcast
is
over.
I
kid.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I do love cats.
Right.
I had 5 at one time in my life, but that was only briefly. Very briefly. But anyway, I think the Noldor are the cats because they're the ones that they never want to sit still. They're restless.
They're doing the stray cat strut.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Vanyar are sort of the loyal dogs that want to stay on Taniquetil with the Valar. But obviously, we're probably already taking Maria's analogy.
We are way too far. We do that. It's so much fun.
Oh, yeah. But I do think it's a fascinating analogy. I love the comparison you've drawn here, Maria. And I think that it's a really good way to start off this episode because I think there is a big difference between the Noldor and the Vanyar and even the Noldor and the Teleri that we see right here at the beginning of the chapter. So
that's true.
I wanted to use that as sort of a segue to jump right into the very beginning of the chapter.
Well, let's do that because with a long discussion, we might as well get started early, right?
Might as well. We might as well. Well, I'll take this one if you don't mind.
Okay, no, please, by all means.
So this is the very first paragraph of the chapter. Now the 3 kindreds of the Eldar were gathered at last in Valinor, and Melkor was chained. This was the noontide of the Blessed Realm, the fullness of its glory and its bliss, long in tale of years, but in memory too brief. In those days the Eldar became full-grown in stature of body and of mind, and the Noldor advanced ever in skill and knowledge, and the long years were filled with their joyful labors, in which many new things, fair and wonderful, were devised. So it's very subtle. I hate to use that word because we're going to
talk about subtle later,
quite a bit later. But it's almost obscured, this idea that the Noldor are very different. Thank you. That the Noldor are a little bit different from the Vanyar and the Teleri. We see that the Eldar are becoming full grown, but it's the Noldor that are advancing in skill and knowledge.
Very good point.
And I think that, as we will see, particularly towards the end of the chapter, we talked last time, the Vanyar are happy to just hang out with the Valar, bask in the light of the two trees, so much so that they actually leave the city of Tirion and the Tower of Mindon El Dalievo, which they themselves
we saw that at
built.
the end of the last chapter where the Vanir did that. Yeah.
Right, and they moved to Taniquetil to just hang out with Manwë and Varda and just
bask in the glory of Manwë.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, and just have festivals and all the fun stuff that goes along with that. The Teleri, on the other hand, they certainly perfected the art of shipbuilding. A lot of that they learned from Ose. We don't really hear of shipbuilding technology or advances in navigation. They just kind of get the idea that the Teleri do their own thing. They build their ships and they go out and explore the seas.
Okay.
But the Noldor are the ones that we hear of advancing in skill and knowledge, and they're the ones that we see always striving. They're kind of restless in a way.
They are, yeah, clearly.
We see that are not.
In specific examples, but also in general, yeah.
And I think their desire to advance their lore, to sort of strive to do things, to learn things, to subcreate things, I think it is a gift, but it's also a vulnerability.
Much so.
And I think it's something that makes them so much more human, in fact, than the other kindreds of the Eldar. And I want to come back to this again later on.
Yeah, well, we will. There's a very specific breakdown of the three kindred in terms of how they respond later to Melkor. That's really telling. Yeah, that I think sheds even more light on this. But that's a good point. It does make them more human in a way. In a way, as we'll see, it sort of presages the fall. That in itself is, again, human, and it's that weakness.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting that, once again, Tolkien has kind of suggested here that the weakness is a desire for more knowledge. That not so much that that's the weakness, but that it is the point of vulnerability, that it is
that's a
in
good way
itself
to put it.
perfectly fine. It's not a weakness. It can be a strength, but it can lead to bad things if one's not very careful.
And we see that over and over again in the Legendarium. We saw it even with Aule himself in Chapter 2.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Well, let's see. So Melkor is in chains. It is, like you said, it's the noontide of the Blessed Realm. But I find that interesting because, once again, we're marking time, aren't we?
Absolutely.
The count of days is continuing, so the clock keeps ticking.
Right.
And we don't know what it's ticking towards, but there's a little bit of foreboding here, that's for sure.
If there's a noontide, there's going to be a sundown.
That is true. There will be a sunset. Rumil of Tirion. We get the next line after the passage you read. Is the first one. He's the name of the lore master who first achieved fitting signs for the recording of speech and song, some for graving upon metal or in stone, and others for drawing with brush or with pen. This is an opportunity for us word nerds to have a little written language sidebar.
Oh, yes.
The
I've been waiting for this.
Yeah, I bet you have. The alphabet that he develops is called Sarati. It is each Sarat, each letter, represents a sound. But only consonants were written in this alphabet. Vowels were written, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to think of some other languages that do this. I know ancient Hebrew does this, where
Hebrew and Arabic both do it.
And Arabic both do this?
Yeah.
Okay, where the vowels are written as little accents or signs that modify the consonants. So all you see if you're looking at the word are the consonants, but then there's little symbols that tell you what vowel sound to make between the consonants.
Right.
I did know ancient Hebrew was the only one I could think of that did that, and I know even modern Hebrew there's a tendency to avoid that, right? They actually spell out the vowels now from what my minimal research showed me.
I don't know. That very well could be.
If anybody wants to pipe in, send us a message. That'd be cool. I'm just curious. But and what was really kind of interesting.
Well, it's not an uncommon system. I know there are others out there.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, it seems like the Semitic languages are the ones, the Arabic and Hebrew that pick up. Anyway. But
Very
if anybody can give us more information on that, I would love that.
That'd be cool. The language, interestingly, the alphabet seems to have been written in totally different ways. Sometimes it was right to left, or even alternating right to left, left to right. But in books, it was top to bottom, beginning at the top right. So it was a very flexible writing
very,
system.
very flexible, yeah.
Lefties and righties didn't have any problems. They could both write however they wanted, I guess.
One has to assume that maybe it was because it was such an early, rudimentary script. It was just, let's just fit the letters on there however we can. It wasn't overburdened with conventions, the way a lot of modern languages are. Or
I would assume there'd be an easy way to figure it out by looking at the page, which direction to read.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm thinking if somebody wrote English that way, I'd figure out pretty quickly that reading it left to right isn't making any sense. I must find another way. But yeah.
Well, and sometimes I've seen, not to go way too far afield.
Well, yeah, word nerds, we could go really far afield on this, right?
But I have seen ancient Greek written in this right to left, or left to right, then right to left fashion, and sometimes they actually mirror the letters. So the letters are written backwards, so you know which way the text is supposed to be read. That
would be interesting. Boy,
I don't know if that's what was going on with Sarati, but
no. I know that they mirrored some of the characters. Well, in the vertical, the top to bottom, one of the things that they did is they would sometimes mirror the I can't remember the markers now, but the glyphs that would go to the side of the stems.
Is it?
Go ahead.
Is it the vowel, not the vowel diacritics you're thinking of?
No, it was the shapes, the kind of, well, I know that in Tengwar it was the bows.
They've got stems and bows,
stems and bows.
Right.
It was similar to that where they would mirror it, but
right.
Or maybe it was Tengwar that was mirrored when it went vertical. Was Tengwar ever vertical? We'll get to that. Never mind.
I don't remember.
We are getting a little too far into the word nerd stuff. We apologize. Well, maybe we don't really apologize.
So we're not apologizing too much, but
we're just kind of like saying sorry it took us so long to get out of that. But
yeah.
Interestingly, we don't get any information on the runes, the stuff that's for graving upon metal or in stone. We only get information in other sources about drawing with brush or pen. So we don't know what the actual runes looked like, but it wasn't the ones that we're familiar with, the little Gandalf rune with the vertical stroke and the two diagonal strokes.
Two diagonal strokes that go up. Yeah, it wasn't.
Right. It wasn't that one
because we know that one was developed in Beleriand by one of the Sindar.
Dairon, if I remember correctly.
Dairon, that's correct. And although this is not the Tengwar, this is a precursor to the Tengwar, which we'll find out later in this chapter. And though I think there's only a few examples of Sarati that are out there, but
very few. Tolkien actually wrote it in himself. He wrote
right. It was his own first alphabet that he created, wasn't it?
Yeah, he wrote in a diary in it. He wrote in his diary in this alphabet.
I think, even in his own language creation, it was a precursor to the Tengwar, wasn't it? So,
well, certainly, yeah.
So the internal history of it mirrors the actual history of Tolkien's creation of it.
Not a surprise.
No, not at all.
Not a surprise at all.
But you can see that Sarati does look a bit like Tengwar. I think most of the glyphs tend to be sort of on their side instead of the stems and the bows off to the right or the left. I think most of the stems are horizontal and the bows would go up, if I'm remembering correctly.
I think so.
But it does seem to have worked.
But maybe that was only when it was written vertically. I don't know.
Oh, that's a good question. I wonder.
I'll have to look that up. That's probably not something we'll do here because it's very visual. It's not really something we can focus on the podcast. But anyway, interesting sidebar. So for those of you who are also word nerds, take a look at that. I think the information I found on that was was it in Peoples of Middle-earth or no? No, it was. Well, I'm going to have to actually post that later. I don't remember where I have that information.
I don't remember where we found that. We'll put it up on the website.
The show notes or something. Yeah. Or at least the Facebook page. So the next thing we get, the famous. I'll just take this next paragraph.
Go for it.
In that time was born in Eldamar, in the house of the king in Tirion upon the crown of Tuna, the eldest of the sons of Finwë, and the most beloved. Curu Finwë was his name, but by his mother he was called Fëanor, spirit of fire, and thus he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor. Okay, so we finally get to see the famous Fëanor born. We get a little bit of names, too, right? We get Cúru Finwë, but by his mother he was called Fëanor. Now, what is that? We see this sometimes where people have two names. We get to do another sidebar. This is why the chapter is going to be so long, Sean.
Yep.
We're in the second paragraph, and we're on a second sidebar. But it's a really interesting thing, and this is probably the best place for it.
Yeah, this is definitely the place where we're going to see such a prominent name for someone that is not the name by which we usually know them.
So here's the thing. This information, just so you're aware, if anybody wants to look it up, a lot of this comes from History of Middle-earth, the last volume, which is Peoples of Middle-earth. Mm-hmm. There's a thing called the Shibboleth of Fëanor, and there's a section in there. And then there's also a section, oh no, that's just of his sons' names. I'm so sorry. This comes from Morgoth's Ring, Laws and Customs of the Eldar.
That's right, and that's where there's a whole essay on naming in that
naming. One. Yeah, the stuff in the Shibboleth of Fëanor is about his sons and what their names were, their mother names and their father names and all of that. But specifically about the concept of the names, the elves were traditionally given father names at or shortly after birth. These are the names are called their esse, E-S-S-E. And when they were older, they would get a second name from their mother, the Amalese. The father name was usually derived from his name. That's why he was named Cúru Finwë, which is crafty Finwë.
I don't know why that makes me laugh.
Crafty son of Finwë, and that probably gives you a clue. It wasn't at birth because he wouldn't have known he was crafty right away. Mm-hmm. But he was able to determine that, make that determination. But later, when he was older, he was given this mother name of Spirit of Fire. So the mother name typically described appearance or a character trait. We get some other father names, sons of Fëanor. We'll see later on. Some of them we know by their mother names, like Maedhros. His name was actually Nelia Finwë, which just means third Finwë.
Third Finwë.
And Amras.
Finwë number 3.
Yeah, Finwë number 3. I'll take mine. It's fine behind Finwë number 3. And then, of course, we get the sad name for Amras, Telu Finwë, which just means last Finwë. I'm out of names, buddy. I'm just going to call you Last Finwë.
It reminds me a little bit of, was it George Foreman?
Who had named all his kids George.
Named all his kids George Foreman.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, and he had about 7 of them, too, didn't he?
Did.
He had a lot of kids.
Oh, man. But, so third Finwë, there was a second Finwë. I don't remember. Well, it would have been his oldest son, I'm sure. But so you get third Finwë, last Finwë. So those are father names. They're just very they descend from the father's name. And they're just descriptive of where they fit in the chronology. But the examples of mother names are interesting. Not only, Maedhros was one, and I don't have the meaning of that in front of me, but my favorite was Galadriel's mother name. Her mother name was Nerwen, which doesn't, when you know what it stands for, is kind of a little insulting. Man maiden.
I think it was.
She's a man, baby.
She's a man maiden.
Due to her height, strength, and pride.
That's what I was thinking. It was her stature and her bearing, wasn't it?
It wasn't.
There was a regality.
She wasn't mannish. She was just tall, strong, and very proud. And we know that. We see that's actually one of her character flaws.
Right.
But it's interesting, that we get, so mother names were typically based on appearance or character. And then they also had chosen names that they would personally choose themselves. But here's the funny thing. We don't have any of those because they weren't used by people who didn't know them. They were very personal. And so, of course, they wouldn't appear in a history because the history writer didn't necessarily know it. And even if they did, it would be like me telling some family secret in a history. So we don't have any of those.
It's very interesting.
It is interesting. We literally have 0 examples of a chosen name. At least as far as I can find. I'm sure somebody's going to dig one up out of some
I would love it if somebody
will.
Yeah, if somebody can. I would.
I don't have any prizes for you other than to say congratulations if you do.
We'll give you a shout out on the next episode.
Well, of course we will. Of course we will. If that's a prize.
It's an interesting little detail that Tolkien worked in there, though, isn't it?
It is.
They should have chosen names, sort of,
their own,
not pet names, but just very personal names.
They're very personal. They were private but not secret. I do remember that line being very specific in the text. That is, it's not that they weren't known, it's that they were private. They were for kin and for very close friends.
Mm-hmm.
And you would certainly never call somebody by their chosen name, even if you were aware of it, unless that was appropriate. But there
So
were... Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. Oh, never mind. I just answered it. I was trying to think, what is there an example? Because it looks like in a lot of cases, so the father name is first. The father name is the name that they're born with, or they get shortly after birth.
Right.
The esse. And then the amelesse, the mother name, would be one that they get later in life. So it seems like in most cases, the amelesse, the mother name, ends up replacing the father name. And I was going to ask if there are any examples of the opposite, but Galadriel is an example.
Oh, Galadriel is an excellent example of that, because that's called an aftername. That's different from the father name, mother name, or even the chosen name. These are names given later in life, sometimes by kin, sometimes not, and in this case it's not. Galadriel is the Sindarin version of Alatariel. Now that's Telerin for maiden crowned by a radiant garland.
Beautiful.
And that was given to her by Celeborn. So, beautiful stuff. Those particular really cool names do come from the Shibboleth, just so you guys know. That's the Shibboleth of Fëanor, part of the peoples of Middle-earth.
Right.
So that's
really interesting stuff.
It is, and there's a ton of stuff there. Read up on that, and read up on the naming in Laws and Customs. I think you'll find some really interesting stuff.
I think at some point we'll have to do a special episode on just some of this stuff.
Some of those essays.
The Laws and Customs of the
Laws
Eldar.
and Customs almost does require its own, doesn't it? The Shibboleth certainly does not. It's mostly about one letter.
That's right.
It really is. It's about the S and the thorn
to the S. Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Only a philologist could find that worthy of an entire passage, but it is interesting. Yeah. No, there are some things in the history of Middle Earth once we're done with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and Unfinished Tales and Tales from the Perilous Realm. So sometime in 2026.
Let's not hold our breath. It's what he's saying.
It's kind of what I'm saying, yeah. I'd love to do that, but, by that point, really.
Well, we may have to look for some special episodes to drop in here and there when we can.
That's true.
I won't promise anything.
In fact, we do know we need to do some special episodes coming up, right? I mean, we've talked about maybe eventually doing a special one on or special one or two on Kullervo, because the book just released last month here in the U.S. And there may be a couple of special episodes coming up soon, might there? Not?
Yeah. There might.
We'll just leave that hanging out there.
We'll see what we can do.
Yeah, we'll have to nail some details down before we tease you all any further. But just suffice it to say, I think you'll all find it interesting.
Yeah.
So let's see. So where are we? So now Fëanor's been born, and we find out a little bit about Míriel, and it is sad, but it gives us an opportunity to discuss some more fun stuff. Míriel was the name of his mother, who was called Serinde, because of her surpassing skill in weaving and needlework, for her hands were more skilled to fineness than any hands even among the Noldor. The love of Finwë and Míriel was great and glad, for it began in the blessed realm in the days of bliss. But in the bearing of her son, Míriel was consumed in spirit and body, that would be in Fea and Roa, and after his birth she yearned for release from the labor of living. And when she had named him, she said to Finwë, "Never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor." Well, it doesn't end there, of course. Finwë's very upset. He's very sad. He thinks, well, I'm of course you're tired, and okay, maybe you won't be able to have any more kids, but there's got to be healing. We can get some rest. So he talks to Manwë. Manwë gives her over to Irmo in Lorien, and he's sad because he doesn't want her to miss the early days of youth. And then she says something very key here. Go ahead.
I want to throw out there. So remember that Irmo in the Gardens of Lorien. Yes. That is the place where rest can be found in Aman. That's the place where even the Valar themselves find their rest.
Yes, very key. And we talk about healing. We're going to get to see another of the Maya here pretty soon. But this is an important line, and I really want to get enough emphasis on it. When this happens, she then says, "It is indeed unhappy," said Míriel, "and I would weep if I were not so weary. But hold me blameless in this, and in all that may come after."
It's just so telling.
It's very telling. Hold me
You're
blameless
thinking, hold me
in
blameless
this,
in what exactly?
and in all that may come after.
And in all that may come after.
There is...
She knows that her death, if she dies, and she is about to do so, but she knows that, and it's only because it's the next sentence.
Exactly. And you should have read this chapter before the episode, folks. So if I'm spoiling something that's on the next page, that's your problem, not mine.
Should be a huge spoiler.
Okay.
But she knows that this is going to have far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, she's well aware that she could be blamed. She could be held morally culpable for what's about to come. And then there's the foreboding part of all that may come after. She went then to the gardens. We'll get to the end of the passage, and then we'll discuss it. She went to the gardens of Lorien and lay down to sleep. But though she seemed to sleep, her spirit indeed departed from her body and passed in silence to the halls of Mandos.
There you go. It's not spoiled anymore.
No, it's not spoiled. The maidens of Este, there's the maidens of Este, tended the body of Míriel, and it remained unwithered, but she did not return. Then Finwë lived in sorrow, and he went often to the gardens of Lorien, and sitting beneath the silver willows beside the body of his wife, he called her by her names. But it was unavailing, and alone in all the blessed realm he was deprived of joy. After a while, he went to Lorien no more. Heartbreak.
Very sad.
Very, very poignant. She was definitely aware of what she was about to do. There's no question.
She
was
went to
going
Lorien
to give up,
knowing that she was going to give
up the ghost,
on life,
as they say.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that an elf can, without destroying the Hroa, like what we would consider suicide, she could her Fëa could abandon her Hroa and leave.
She departed from her body.
She departed from her body willingly and intentionally. And as we'll see, she makes that decision permanent. Though it doesn't. Yeah.
And this is the only death like this that we see for an elf.
It is. It is. And I think it might be because it's until Finwë, something happens to Finwë. I did give that away. Until something happens to Finwë, there really are no other deaths in Aman.
Right.
The rest of the time, they're back in Middle-earth. And one assumes there might be some difference there. I don't know. But I also want to discuss, was she aware, when she talks about never again shall I bear a child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor, she was certainly aware then that this much strength went into him. Does it mean she had the conscious ability to make that decision, to pour that much life into him? I mean, I don't know. There's certainly nothing in the text we have to speculate that. We know a little bit from Laws and Customs of the Eldar about their
how much goes into their childbearing and child rearing.
And it is significant.
Yeah.
It's incredibly significant. But
that's a really good question.
But one wonders if this was an ability.
Did she choose to give him an extra share or all of her
literally all of herself,
her life force? Yeah.
And if so, was that a moral decision to make? Did she have the right to do that?
Yeah.
Because, as we'll see, her decision then leads to a whole lot of problems.
Well, yes, absolutely.
And even if it didn't lead to those other problems, it would have led to at least one problem. Her husband's abandoned, and her son doesn't have a mother.
Yeah.
That's two problems. I need to count.
Whole lot of problems.
Yeah, a whole lot of mess comes out of this. But
and I think Tolkien himself said that her choosing to die had disastrous results.
Yeah, it's in one of the letters.
It's in letter 212. He says that Míriel tried to die, which had disastrous results, leading to the fall of the High Elves.
Ooh! Wow!
This death started a chain reaction that led ultimately to all of the bad things that are going to happen. Yeah. Now, we'll get to those in due time.
Yeah.
It is very common.
That's what the whole book's about.
That's true.
All the bad things that are going to happen.
It's very common to lay the blame for those things that are going to happen on Fëanor.
Oh, and we will.
On Melkor.
We will.
And we will. Melkor, not as much as you might think, for reasons we're going to get to later in this episode.
Right.
But But it's interesting that Tolkien himself believed that Míriel's decision had a lot to do with it. Míriel has some culpability for this as well.
She really does. And we'll see that a little bit later. We're going to have a really fun discussion where we get into the debate that the Valar had about this, about her death.
Yeah.
So, ooh, wow. I just heard that. Ladies and gentlemen, Sean's in Texas, and they are experiencing a massive thunderstorm. I don't know if you guys heard it, but I just heard a big old thunderburst. So if he disappears, just know that he has angered Manwë, and you and I will continue the conversation for a few moments while he comes back.
And I'm still here for now.
We hope.
My spirit has not departed from the podcast just yet.
That's a good thing. That's a very good thing.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to know about
the disastrous results.
The all that may come after would really be a problem.
Right.
So she leaves her body, and Finwë's incredibly sad, and eventually stops going to Lorien, and focuses on his son. So Fëanor grows swiftly, and Tolkien actually says, as if a secret fire were kindled within him. I love that. He doesn't use words accidentally, but this is a secret fire, not
secret fire, not
secret fire capitalized.
Capitalized, capital F.
But I do think there's something there. This is an intense young man.
Yes, he is. And we get a very nice description of him here.
Yeah, that he's tall, fair of face, so he's very, handsome, good looking, and masterful. We're going to come back to that word in just a second. But more of his physical description, his eyes piercingly bright and his hair raven dark. So now we've got his physical description and one word about his personality. We're going to get the rest of his personality. In the pursuit of all his purposes, eager and steadfast. Few ever changed his courses by counsel, none by force. He became, of all the Noldor, then or after, the most subtle in mind and the most skilled in hand. Let's talk about
the thunder's
these.
Going in the background as you read about Fëanor. This is very foreboding.
This is Manwë saying, don't even talk about this guy. Masterful. So looking that up,
we need to look at that's a very important.
That's a powerful word. When you look that up, the definition you get, certainly the definition that Tolkien had in mind here, because it can also mean highly adept or skillful. That's not what he meant here, I don't think. It's inclined and usually competent to act as master, suggestive of a domineering nature.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very clearly Fëanor from the get-go.
Yeah. Well, he's both, to be fair.
He is usually competent to act, too. But
Tolkien's excellent use of language, he finds one word that has two
double meaning,
wildly different connotations.
Yeah, it really does.
But this, I found a definition actually, not just the inclination, but the desire to master others.
Ooh, yeah.
And there is that. We'll see that later in this chapter.
We'll see it very explicitly. Well, almost explicitly.
yeah. That's true. Yeah,
it is still an implication, but it's a pretty clear.
It's a very clear implication in about half a page, maybe a page or page here. And I can't help but think of someone else that we've seen.
Oh, yes.
Who had the desire to master others.
Oh, who might that possibly be?
Someone whose name begins with an L and rhymes with Fëanor.
What?
And of course it's Melkor.
Rhymes with Fëanor.
The last part.
Oh, man.
Yeah. There are a number of comparisons that can be drawn between Fëanor and Melkor.
Oh, yeah.
We will see many of them in this chapter.
Many more.
Again, Fëanor is a controversial figure. A lot of people do see him as an anti-hero. A lot of people are big fans of Fëanor. I think both you and I are more in the Fëanor as a villain camp.
Yeah, hard to see him as anything but a villain after what he does.
It is.
A few chapters.
Certainly later on.
Yeah, not yet. He's just on the scene, but yes.
He starts out, very gifted. He starts out with gifted. He's got a lot of great things going for him. And he does a lot of wonderful things. We'll see some of the
he creates
beautiful
the
artifacts,
most beautiful things ever made. He actually, and no doubt about it, some of the most significant and important things ever made. But
we'll save this for the next episode when we get to that chapter. But even that act, I think, is is a little bit selfish.
It is. Well, and we see it we'll see that in the next chapter. I also thought there was something else.
I just want to acknowledge that I know that there are a lot of people who are big fans of Fëanor. I think that if you read the text carefully, he is at best an anti-hero who turns into a villain. At worst, he is somebody who kind of had it in him all along.
Yeah, and that's, well, we'll see where he goes, but I kind of lean more towards the latter. I'm sorry to say. I mean, I admire him. How can you not admire his talent? But
absolutely.
Yeah, we see some big red flags early on. I mean, not only masterful here, but we also see, and this was a little more hard to pick up, but in the pursuit of all his purposes, eager and steadfast, one thinks of those things as good. I want to think that's a great thing. I wonder sometimes, though, if one can be too steadfast in pursuing one's goals. That is to the exclusion of all others, as we'll start to see later.
Yes.
But I think really there's two things here in this next paragraph or next few lines that are really key. One of them is, few ever changed discourses by counsel, none by force. Now, that latter part's okay, none by force. I don't want somebody to force me to change my mind. But the former's a problem.
I'll change your mind someday about that, Alan.
By force?
By force, yes.
Oh,
Just
man.
you wait.
Well, remember when we compared Melkor and Aule a few chapters back? One of the differences we talked about was that Aule sought and gave counsel.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at the time that I was reminded of Proverbs 12:15, that the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to counsel. Mm-hmm. So I've got to say, it's not a good thing to have it said of you that few ever changed discourses by counsel. That's not a good thing.
No, that is not a good thing. It's basically like saying that even after you listened to reason, you still did what you were planning to do.
You
all
are
along.
a stubborn bleep.
Stubborn is the word
mule.
for it. Absolutely.
I'll just say mule. Stubborn mule. How's that?
Well, and by thinking of that way, that previous line about him being steadfast sounds
a little like stubborn too.
A little more like stubborn. Yeah, absolutely.
But there's another word here that's even more tricky. That he became of all the Noldor then or after the most subtle in mind. Now,
yes,
I did not even think of this the first, I don't know, dozen times I read this. I just thought subtle, like we think of subtle as being kind of unnoticed, stealthy maybe, but
kind of smooth,
under the radar.
Right.
But that's not what Tolkien means here, and it's a word that we need to look at it in context. You've got a couple of places where you've found it used again. It's not with positive connotations. What do we have?
I have seen several instances of subtle, and I don't think I can't find one place where Tolkien uses it with
it's not positive
connotations.
Ever. No.
So in the Vala Quenta, we talked about this one already. We read that of Melkor, read of Melkor that understanding he turned to subtlety in perverting to his own will all that he would use.
Yep.
So that's in the Vala Quenta.
Yep.
Later on in the essay of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, we learned that Saruman, who is referred to as Curanir in that essay, was subtle in speech and skilled in all the devices of smithcraft. So
that worked out well.
Right. And think about in the Two Towers that Saruman's primary weapon is his voice.
Yeah.
So think about that in terms
subtle
of this description of subtle in speech.
Mm-hmm.
It's also used a couple of times in the Two Towers of Saruman.
Yeah.
It's used a couple of times of Denethor in Return of the King.
And then Denethor uses it, says it of Gandalf, but he's not using it as a compliment, is he?
No, he is
You're
not.
wise, maybe, Mithrandir, yet with all your subtleties, you have not all wisdom.
Right. And so there it's used of a character that we know to be a hero, but as you say, it's being used as an insult.
As a slander, right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, here's the thing. When you look it up, you actually get the definition. If you research the word and you look at what it means, the meaning that Tolkien clearly is intending here is cunning, wily, or crafty, insidious in operation. Insidious. Clever.
That is definitely a negative word.
Yeah. Clever and indirect, not showing your real purpose. Lying by omission, one might suggest. But so again, subtlety here is not like, oh wow, he's just, before you know it, you're in agreement with him because he's just so subtle in how he doesn't come off too strong.
It's more than like gently persuasive. That's not what we're talking about here.
That's not what we're talking about.
It is deceitful.
Yeah, flat out.
And I like the idea of lies by omission.
Yeah. Clever and indirect, not showing your real purpose.
Concealing some of your true purpose. Yeah.
And we get that. We see that a lot. So I think it's important that we see here that Tolkien is already setting this up to point out that Fëanor is not necessarily, the hero of the story here.
Right. That's why we're both in that camp of he's clearly a villain.
But he's very accomplished, and we get to see some of his skills here. The first thing we see is that he devises the letters that bear his name, in which the Eldar used ever after. So that's the Tengwar that we talked about earlier.
And they are occasionally called the Fëanorian letters, or the Fëanorian script.
Yeah. And then it was also he who first discovered how gems greater and brighter than those of the earth might be made with skill. The first guy who made cubic zirconia. Get your knockoff rings right here. Fëanor's specials, $5.
Oh man.
The first gems the first gems that Fëanor made were white and colorless.
This is true.
But of course, these were much, much greater. Being set under starlight, they would blaze with blue and silver fires brighter than Halloween. And other crystals he made also. Hang on to this. Listen carefully to this. Wherein things far away could be seen small but clear, as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë.
What does that sound like?
What crystals might there be wherein things far away could be seen small but clear?
Let's ask Subtle Denethor if he knows.
Subtle Denethor. Well, one of them still has his handprints on them.
That's right.
These, my friends, are the Palantiri.
They are.
Absolutely. There's a line from Unfinished Tales that makes this pretty clear, and then Sean actually found a reference in the index that I don't think I'd ever seen. That when it talks about the Palantiri, it just flat out says "made by Fëanor."
Right, made by Fëanor and Amon. See page 64, which is exactly this passage.
But the line from Unfinished Tales just describes the Palantiri. This is from the Palantiri. In section 4 of Unfinished Tales, says that they were perfect spheres, appearing when at rest to be made of solid glass or crystal, deep black in hue. So these are they're crystals. These are the Palantiri. So he made the Palantiri. Done and done.
Yeah.
And what's funny is I think we've had discussions about this. Like, well, maybe he did. Certainly, it was his technology. His research. No, he made them.
It wasn't until I think reading for this episode that I picked up that it was absolutely them.
Yeah, that's them.
And we're not told how many there are. We always think of there being 7, but that's 7 that were in Middle Earth. We know there were. Is it 4 in Arnor and 3 in Gondor, or do I have that backwards? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't remember right now.
Yeah, but there was also one in Tolerace, wasn't there?
I believe so.
That they
communicated with it. The faithful would,
Right, but there must have been others in Amon too, and who knows where those are by the Third Age? But it's interesting to think of Fëanor just making Palantiri and just handing them out to all his friends like pagers, or I guess I'm showing my age, like cell phones.
Like pagers. Yeah, you really are showing your age.
And I'm showing my Americanness by calling them cell phones. Mobiles.
You know what? That's true. We have such an international audience. We need to make sure we're, appropriately using language.
Yeah.
So Palantiri, isn't that cool? You find something new every time you read the book, right? That's what we talk about.
And that's why the Silmarillion is so fun. Even if you are a Lord of the Rings fan, and Lord of the Rings is always going to be your favorite book by Tolkien. And I think even you've said that, Alan. You still love
Return of the King is still my favorite one volume, one book.
But there's just so much interesting stuff that teaches you more about the world.
Yeah, it really does. There's one last line here that's almost a throwaway. Seldom were the hands and mind of Fëanor at rest. And again, I have to wonder if that's a good thing. Is this just him being productive, or? And again, I know I'm probably reading into this one this time, but I almost sense a little bit of impatience.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right.
We'll see it again later, but I remember when we talked about the sins of Melkor, that impatience was one.
Impatience of the void. Yeah.
So just keep your eyes out for these things, folks. That's one of the fun things about reading this so many times, is you start to pick up these themes and you start to see some threads that really help you get a better image of the whole picture.
Yeah.
So he gets married. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's get this guy married. He'll find
let's get him married off. Maybe that'll chill him out, right?
Yeah. He'll find something else to do with his time.
Oh yeah. Yes, he does. So in his early youth, so probably, well, let's see, we know that elves typically marry by the time they're about 50 when they mature. So probably in his 50s there, he wedded Nerdanel, the daughter of a great smith named Matan, among those of the Noldor most dear to Aule. And of Matan he learned much of the making of things in metal and in stone. Mm-hmm. This is an important line right here. Nerdanel also was firm of will, but more patient than Fëanor, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them. And at first she restrained him when the fire of his heart grew too hot. But his later deeds grieved her, and they became estranged. Desiring to understand minds rather than to master them. Mm-hmm. That sort of comparison is pretty clear. This is what we talked about, how it is still implication, but it's a pretty obvious.
It's a very clear indication that this passage about Nerdanel actually tells us more about Fëanor than it does about her.
Fëanor desires to master minds.
Right.
And so now we really get an understanding of what masterful meant in that earlier line.
Absolutely. And we see other things about her. His heart grew hot, and she restrained him.
Temperamental.
Yep.
Yeah.
They were both firm of will, but he was definitely impatient. So, so she was more patient than Fëanor. So that's again a clear implication that he was impatient. So
we get impatience and a will and a desire to dominate others.
Right.
Does this remind you of anybody yet? Just saying.
It's right here in the text.
I mean, come on, we're not making this up, folks.
Right.
So those of you who are big Fëanor fans, I almost apologize for kind of ruining your hero, but you're going to figure it out soon enough.
Well, again, he did great things, but
he did absolutely. Just as we will find out, this is one of those things where everything is really spabimmy, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
That's really what, even though Iluvatar at that moment when he talks about, and as a reminder, that's shall prove but mine instrument. For those of you who didn't listen to episode 2, I realized I'm using an acronym that nobody necessarily, new listeners might not know. Back in episode 2, we talked about Melkor, and we talked about how Iluvatar said that you can't alter the music in my despite, and if you try, you shall but prove mine instrument to make things that were even better than you imagined.
It's basically the doctrine that anything the bad guys try to screw up in this world
evil will be turned to good.
Is something that Iluvatar will turn to good.
Yeah, Iluvatar will take even the evil from Ardamard and turn it to good.
And usually into something, I guess, better is hard to say because it is Ardamard.
It's hard to qualify.
But new beauty, new and unexpected beauty.
Unexpected, that's a good way to put it, yeah. Mm-hmm. So they became estranged, but that estrangement didn't happen right away. Why? Oh, no.
It certainly didn't.
7 sons she bore to Fëanor. 7.
7 sons.
Let's be clear, that's a lot. We learn in Laws and Customs of the Eldar that there were seldom more than 4 children in any house, and that Fëanor was renowned as the father of 7 sons. The histories record none that surpassed him. Mm-hmm. So maybe we needed to hold out for that bow chicka wow wow for Fëanor rather than for Aule or for I'm sorry, for Tulkas.
Yeah, I mean, obviously opposites attract a lot.
Oh, clearly, yeah,
over and over again.
Yeah, boy, this must have been, but it must have been a really, at that point, a very deep love between them because we also
absolutely, because
they didn't have kids just because.
No, they didn't, and this is also in Laws and Customs of the Valar that,
of the Eldar.
I'm sorry.
Laws and Customs of the Valar. Right. Short list, do what Manwë says.
Right, right. Sorry. Laws and Customs of the Eldar is what Sean meant to say. We do learn there. Now, it doesn't go into details, folks, but
no, it is not. It is not Elvish erotica.
No, and this is a family podcast.
Thank you.
But we do learn that that elves only perform the act of love to beget children. And that once they create children, their desire to do so ceases, but they stay together. I think this is part of why.
It's a very deeply Catholic reflection
of
Tolkien's beliefs, isn't it?
That's true. It absolutely is. They stay together to raise the children. And there's actually this. I just want to read this quick passage from the Morgoth's Ring, which is
Laws and Customs.
Laws and Customs of the Eldar. It would seem to any of the Eldar a grievous thing if a wedded pair were sundered during the bearing of a child, or while the first years of its childhood lasted, for which reason the Eldar would beget children only in days of happiness and peace, if they could. Now, if they could, so there again, there are way more details about marriage and things like that when it was a time of crisis. But I think what's important,
and we'll see some of those, I think, later on.
That's true, we will. But what's important here is that if they could, they would only have children when it's a time of happiness and peace. This is part of why we don't see elf children later in the Silmarillion.
Yeah.
Spoilers, there's going to be a war. Sorry.
or more than one.
More than one, it's true. That's why we don't see elf children in Lord of the Rings, because it is not a time of happiness and peace for the elves or anyone. But
true.
But here, Fëanor and Ne'er-do-Nell had 7 kids, which tells us that there was very deep love.
Yeah.
Because the elves did not have children unless there was great love there.
True.
And that there was a profound time of peace. And again, this is the noontide of Valinor.
Noontide. That's exactly what I was thinking.
This is the bliss of the bliss for elves.
The high time. This really is. This is their best.
Yeah.
This is the best it's going to be, folks. It only goes downhill from here.
Right, exactly. As we said, there will be a sunset.
Yes, there will. And it also
does
speaks
draw to a close.
It does. It also speaks to a sacrifice on the part of Ne'er-do-Nell because of the amount of effort it takes. Again, something we pick up from Laws and Customs of the Eldar, that their birthing and raising of children is much more strenuous than it is than for humans. And so the amount of effort it would have taken Ne'er-do-Nell to bear 7 children would have been just phenomenal.
Right.
We get one sentence here that is going to then take us into a sidebar that could go for an hour. It won't. We're already at about 50 minutes, so I want to make sure to keep this around maybe 20. But this is a really important sidebar. So here's the line. Now it came to pass that Finwë took as his second wife Eldest the Fair. That's all the Silmarillion tells us. But we need to really dig into this to understand a little bit more. We spent some time, Sean and I, digging into the Laws and Customs of the Eldar to get an understanding of how this worked. How does remarriage work when you're dealing with immortals? And you're dealing with immortals who are supposed to only be married once.
Right.
So it's a long sidebar here on second marriage.
And especially in this case, these immortals are still living in Aman. So, Míriel's Fëa is right down the road in the halls of Mandos.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a long road. Mandos isn't very close to...
Indeed, but yeah.
But yeah, I mean, she's right over there, and you're going to get remarried? How does that work?
Right.
Well, so here's the thing. Finwë wanted more kids. Here we are in the noontide of Valinor. Everybody's having kids. The elf kingdoms, the elf kindreds are growing, and he wants to have more children. So he wants to be remarried because that's the only way it works. There is no, let's be clear, there are no kids outside of marriage because marriage amongst the elves is done when they commit the act. So
right.
If you do that, you're married. So there are no kids born out of wedlock. But marriage was forever since the Fëa could return from Mandos. You might have to wait a very long time, especially... Well, if Ne'er-do-Nell hadn't been estranged from Fëanor, she would have had to wait a very long time.
Right.
One might assume that the statute of Finwë and Míriel might apply to her. But basically, long story short, so here's the TLDR version, right? A decision was made that if the Fëa and Mandos agreed, the still living elf could remarry. So if Míriel agrees, then Finwë could remarry. But here's the catch. The Fëa that's in Mandos would be doomed to remain in Mandos until the end of Arda, because they could never take a body again, because then the still living spouse,
because
in this case,
then he'd have
Finwë,
two wives.
would have two wives living in Arda. That can't happen. So here's the thing. That's the short version. The long version is a really cool debate goes down between the Valar as they discuss how they need to approach this thing, because it revolves around 2 questions. It revolves around death, which is something that was so foreign. And then, of course, it revolves around marriage and how to remedy this problem. So why don't I also... Yeah, go ahead.
Before we jump into it, I just want to say that it's wonderful that Tolkien spends as much time on this as he does in the
Laws and Customs.
The Laws and Customs that we get in Morgoth's Ring.
It's beautiful.
it really is, and it's just fascinating world building. It really just
That's an excellent phrase, because that's what I'm thinking. This is stuff that he didn't necessarily intend for his readers to ever read.
This was just in his mind as he's writing this story.
And yet he had to work it out. He had to fully work it out. And when you read the history of Middle-earth, you also see that he had a written manuscript and then a typescript and notes on both. And Christopher Tolkien's having to kind of jostle between the two and give you notes to kind of put things into context and show you how they developed.
It's not always the easiest read, but
it's not.
But it's so worth the time it takes to delve into it.
It really is.
If you can get a hold of some of those hard to find history of Middle-earth.
They are a little hard to find if you're here in the U.S. I've noticed that the UK publisher, you can actually order them directly from Houghton Mifflin. No, is Houghton Mifflin? I always forget which one's it. HarperCollins.
Houghton
Mifflin's the U.S. Yeah. You can order it directly from the HarperCollins website as a print on demand.
Like a print on demand, isn't it? Yeah.
But it has to be to a UK address.
Right.
So we can't get them.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate. I had to get mine via the 3-volume hardcover. I'd love to get my hands on 12 individual copies.
They are floating around out there.
They are. I like my sets to match, and that's the problem.
I know.
I'd buy one, and then I'd find a paperback here and a hardback over here and a first edition here and a fourth edition there, and I don't.
Yeah, you should see my History of Middle-earth series. I've got the 5 Del Rey paperbacks, the mass
the Del Rey, yeah.
And the pagination doesn't even match up.
Pagination's a mess. At least with this, the pagination. For those of you who aren't word nerds, that means the page numbers. Yeah. Lines up with the original. So
and now we're seriously nerding out on Tolkien book editions.
That's really pathetic.
We should probably pull it.
Let's
back
call it on that, and let's go back into this. So I'll start with Manwë's kind of beginning, the excellent distinction that he makes between healing and justice, and then maybe you can take the next couple of bits. He starts out and he's talking to all of the Valar, and he says, "In this matter, you must not forget that you deal with Arda Mard, out of which ye brought the Eldar. Neither must ye forget that in Arda Mard justice is not healing. Healing cometh only by suffering and patience, and maketh no demand, not even for justice. Justice works only within the bonds of things as they are, excepting the marring of Arda. And therefore, though justice is itself good, and desireth no further evil, it can but perpetuate the evil that was, and doth not prevent it from the bearing of fruit in sorrow." So the statute's just, the statute that would allow Finwë to remarry, but it still brings sorrow because it has to accept things that were never intended for Arda. Death and the severance of Finwë and Míriel. It's just, it's the realization that this is a fallen world. And once again, we come back. This is where we start to kind of bring it back to, like, say, Genesis 3 and the whole idea of a world that's now not in the state that God intended it to be. Well, similarly, this is Arda not in the state that Ilúvatar intended it to be.
Well, and we see over and all how much the Valar struggle with this. We've seen it ever since the overthrow of the lamps by Melkor. The first thing the Valar did was they moved west to Valinor. They put themselves behind this fortress, and that was a good thing because it allowed them to gather their strength and sort of make this stand against Melkor.
True.
But at the same time, they kind of got into this phase where they sort of became idle, and they're like, oh, well, we got the trees here, we're protected by the Pilori. Let's just stay back here. And so Arda sort of languished, and Melkor sort of ran rampant.
Yeah, he did.
And it's not that the Valar obviously had no bad intentions. They really don't know how to deal with an Arda Mard.
No.
Certainly not this early.
Not this early on.
Yeah.
So what does Aule tell us then? Because after Manwë gives that kind of introduction, Aule makes an argument about Fëanor.
He does, yeah. He actually, I'm going to preface it with one sentence, and then I'll skip ahead to the meat. Aule actually pipes up and he says, "But did this matter indeed arise out of Arda Mard? For it seemeth to me that it arose from the bearing of Fëanor," which is Fëanor.
Yeah. I just replaced it with Fëanor because it's too hard.
I know there are too many different. We're dealing with some old versions of the names here, but so he goes on to say that Fëanor is the greatest in gifts that hath arisen or shall arise among the Eldar, and he argues that this really isn't a result of the marring itself. It's actually specifically a result of the birth of Fëanor. He didn't want to believe that any taint of the shadow lay upon Fëanor, or upon any of the Noldor. And he goes on to say that he had been the most eager to summon them to Valinor.
Isn't that
So,
interesting? He was the one. You know,
yeah.
we know that Ulmo opposed it, but we didn't know who supported it. And now we do.
And now we know it was Aule. And again, we know that Aule was very eager to have students and people to share his love of Arda and to teach,
Well,
which
Noldor,
we saw with the creation of the dwarves.
That's exactly what
They
were.
were his, they were his,
Definitely
his disciples.
And it's
And
interesting.
so he refuses to accept that it's it's a result of Arda Mard, or that there's any endemic problem
Yes, that's
with
the
the
thing.
Noldor.
He doesn't want to see that there's an issue there.
Right.
And it's interesting because we see that, Fëanor is his. In the sense that he's a Noldor who studies under Aule. We also know that Sauron was originally a Maya under the service of Aule.
Mm-hmm.
And we see time and time again that we've talked about craft, that those gifts that give somebody great power also give somebody a deep temptation, and that give them a big, big opportunity to fall.
And I think
Aule.
we've been talking about this since our first episode.
Yeah,
I think even going
back.
back to Tolkien's views on progress.
Yeah.
But
Good
poor
stuff.
Aule in a way. I mean, he's who he is because he was made that way. We talked about that.
That's true. He was made as a creator, and he's a creator.
But Aule is the one who's able to keep it pure because he does listen to reason, and he does show humility, and he
takes counsel. Yeah.
He takes counsel, and he shows contrition when he makes a mistake. Right. The one time I guess it's not the one time, because we see him make
we see him
mistakes
make
here and there.
Yeah.
But that's the big one, and he does show contrition, and he like, as you say, he listens to counsel.
Now, before we go on, I wanted to kind of throw out one thing I should have thrown out before I started this. For those of you who are wondering and who've never read the history of Middle-earth, don't worry about it. We're going to give you all the really relevant portions. But one thing is it's not technically canon, so just be aware of that. We say, well, now we know this. We know that now Aule was the one who was most eager to summon them to Valinor. We don't really know that.
That's true.
There's evidence to support that, but technically, because Tolkien never finished these pieces,
right?
And
this stuff is all rough drafts that Christopher Tolkien found in papers that were, preserved in newspapers.
Exactly.
Folded in newspapers.
It was either this or have a garage sale, and thankfully Christopher decided to write the histories of Middle-earth.
Yes. So it's true. We do need to take this.
But I wanted to at least kind of put that disclaimer out there.
Yeah, with kind of a grain of salt. It's very enlightening. If there's ever a discrepancy between the finished
like the
works
names,
and the
for
history of
instance,
yeah, or lineages.
Mm-hmm. Well, or even like we talked about in the episode of The Gift of Death. Very originally, Tolkien did have a kind of rough idea that they would be reincarnated into elvish children. He had quickly abandoned that idea.
Right.
So, we do see a development of thoughts in some of these history works.
Yeah.
But you're right. You have to look to the actual published works as the only things that are canon or canonical. And then this stuff just sheds light on it.
Right.
And some, of course, is closer to being, final than others. Like we talked about, the bit about Glorfindel was actually intended to be.
I think that was one of the later things he wrote. It was one of the
last things he wrote, and he was intending for that to be in something published. Mm-hmm. So, we do know that there are things that are much more likely to be how Tolkien envisioned it.
Right.
And this seems to be one of those pieces, because this had both a handwritten manuscript and a typescript, and it had an extensive series of notes. So we are in kind of the last version of it.
Yeah. Well, and we generally find that as Tolkien gets older, he starts to think about these questions like death and the afterlife, and the
who wouldn't?
Very right, exactly, and these very deeply philosophical questions about the legendarium. So that's what you find in a lot of the later history of Middle-earth.
Filling in the gaps, answering the questions. Right. I think a lot of this, you got to wonder how much of this stemmed from him answering personal correspondence that we see in the letters. And realizing he needs to go back and flesh things out.
Yeah, that could be.
Because some of this stuff really wasn't written until well after The Lord of the Rings had been published.
Right.
So not all of it. I mean, a lot of this goes back. I don't think any of this goes back to the World War I era, but we know that.
No, that would be the earlier.
There's a very big important story that does trace its origins back to like 1914, 1915. So
19. If you're thinking of the one I'm thinking of, it's 1914, and you know the one I'm thinking of.
I do know the one you're thinking of. It starts with Ea and rhymes with Rendil.
Yep. Always. I'm becoming very predictable in my old age. I know.
Johnny One Note over here.
Yep.
So after Aule says that, Ulmo disagrees and says that the birth of Fëanor proceeded from the will of Eru, but the marring of his birth comes from the shadow and is a portent of evils to come. That's very Ulmo-like, kind of dark and foreboding.
It is.
But interestingly, Yavanna, married to Aule, agrees with Ulmo. Hey, Aule, did you finish that couch yet?
We're going to have to get some pillows and fill them with some plant material for Yavanna.
I don't think she's going to give him any plant material.
Yeah.
He's going to have to use
she's putting
dirt.
him on. Oh, yeah, she's putting him on the couch. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. She actually says, "My Lord Aule heirs."
Heirs, my Lord Aule heirs. Wow. Things I don't want to hear my wife say.
Yeah, right.
Well, then again, I don't know that I'd ever hear her say my Lord.
You'd never hear her say, "My Lord Allen."
Not for love or money, no.
Nope.
So she says that the shadow marred the very Hroa of Arda. That is, that it marred the very body, the very essence, the very physical essence of Arda. And all Middle-earth is perverted by the evil of Melkor. None of those who awoke in Middle-earth have come here wholly free. The failing of the strength of the body of Míriel may then be ascribed with some reason to the evil of Arda marred, and her death be a thing unnatural. So
this debate, I know we could spend way more time on it than we should.
Well, hopefully we're flying through it. We're about halfway through the highlights.
What's great about it is you see this event through the eyes of each one of the Valar.
Yeah.
And you see how different they all see it, you know.
And that's really cool, because so often we see the Valar as just a group of people, and you might get one lone voice of dissent.
Right.
But here we get very different takes on this issue.
Yeah. And you see Yavanna, because one of the things I love is, you know, I as much as I really like reading all of Yavanna's stuff, she sees it from the perspective of the taint that's on all of Arda.
Yeah.
And that's some of that, you know, that protective nature mother kind of stuff there.
That's true. She would be the one who noticed that.
Absolutely.
The shadow marred the very physical essence, the very Hroa of Arda. Yeah.
Right. And she would know, because she's seen what it's done to, you know, the Kelvar and the Olvar.
Excellent point. Well, Nienna urges something. What does she talk about here?
So Nienna urges pity, not surprisingly.
Not surprising, yeah.
She says right here that the consideration of the singleness, uniqueness of each that cometh under justice.
That's what pity is. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, right. So she believes that Míriel died by necessity of body, the cost of so great a childbearing.
Okay.
And so I think that's, you know, there's that there's a compassion for the suffering of Míriel in childbirth.
Yeah.
Is really what this is about. And she ultimately comes down on the side of this Manwë's statute being a good thing, because Finwë was bereaved and his natural life and expectation was impaired.
Interesting. Well, Ulmo disagrees, doesn't he? Ulmo's got some great things here. He's got some great points. At the end of the day, does the statute make sense? That is, does it seem fair? Does it seem just that the statute is in place? I would probably say yes, and that's what Mandos tells us. But Ulmo's argument here is pretty sound. He says that the Fëa of Míriel may have departed in necessity, but it also departed with a will not to return, and that's her fault. That will was not, as he says, under compulsion irresistible. Under irresistible compulsion. That's just Tolkien having to speak archaically, I guess. It was a failure in hope by the Fëa, acceptance of the weariness and weakness of the body as a thing beyond healing, and which, therefore, was not healed. He even argues that her decision was selfish. He talks about the impact it has on others, right? The desertion of her spouse and the marring of his life. Fëanor, to be deprived of the mother's part in his nature. But then he points out that Finwë's at fault too, and this is big.
I think this is really big.
He lays a little bit more blame, well, not more blame, but a more serious blame on Finwë. He says, thus the impatience of Finwë will close the door of life upon the Fëa of his spouse. Remember, if she agrees and he remarries, she's stuck in Mandos forever till the end of Arda. She could never be rebodied. So we've talked in that episode about death, about how unnatural that was and how it's important to be in tune, to be in agreement with your nature, the nature of man or the nature of the elves.
Right.
So he's talking here about the nature of the elves. He says, for it is, so this act of Finwë closing the door of life upon his spouse, this is the greater fault, for it is more unnatural that one of the Eldar should remain forever as Fëa without body, than that one should remain alive, wedded but bereaved. He's not wrong, is he?
No.
I mean, if we're talking about nature, the nature of a being, in this
the
case,
nature,
the elf,
right? The nature of the Eldar,
the Fëa and the Hroa to be together,
right? Yeah, their Fëar and their Hroa are really more codependent upon one another than even that of men.
Yeah, it really is.
And so it truly is an unnatural state for them to be separated.
And that's why, when we didn't spend a ton of time on the elvish version of death in that chapter, in that episode, but the whole idea of a houseless spirit was just repulsive. And yet it existed. We know that a lot of the elves didn't necessarily hearken the summons, obey the summons when they died.
Right.
Especially those that never went to Valar in the first place.
Right.
The Morroquendi, the Morroquendi. Well, Mandos closes this, and I apologize for taking some big chunks of text here, but I think it's, first of all, you're not able to read this, listeners, because it's not in the Silmarillion, so we're sharing this with you. So Mandos reminds the Valar, it is your task to deal with Arda Mard, and to declare what is just within it. In other words, we can't look at what it should be, what it ought to have been, what it was. Then he continues, and he says, we may indeed in council point to the higher road. And he's talking about Míriel not despairing of life, or maybe of Finwë being more patient. Either one would have been the higher road. But we cannot make any free creature to walk upon it. Now that leads to tyranny, which disfigures good and makes it seem hateful. Healing by final hope, like Manwë talks about, is a law which one can give to oneself only. Of others, justice alone can be demanded. And he comes down to say, this statute is just. And he's
that's an interesting, this idea that healing by final hope is a law which one can give to oneself only. So healing, what I take from this is healing is one's personal responsibility.
Yeah.
Justice is something that one can demand
your
of
endurance.
Others.
The healing only happens through your hope in Iluvatar and your endurance, and by the choices you make to take that higher road. In this case, for Míriel, that would be returning. Sure, maybe she left because she needed to, but it would be returning to her Hroa. Or, in the case of Finwë, saying, I really would like to get remarried, but I'm not going to.
Right.
And in that patience and in that suffering, healing really comes through suffering, Manwë talks about. And that final hope in Iluvatar that good will come of this, that healing is something you can only do for yourself. You can't make somebody else do it. They could not force Finwë to be patient. They could force him not to get remarried, but it wouldn't change his heart. They can't force Míriel to come back to her Hroa.
Right.
To not be despair of life.
That would lead to tyranny. To
force them to do that.
If they even could.
If they could. You're right. If they have that ability, that power.
And we do see I believe it was in the Vala Quenta where we find that every time the Valar have attempted to force the children of Iluvatar to do something, it hasn't gone well.
Bad ends.
Yeah.
And then he says that of others, justice alone can be demanded. That is, that's the only thing we can make others do. We can only do what's just.
Yeah.
And justice takes into account the fact that we live in a fallen world. That's what he's telling the Valar they have to do. So they come down on the side of the statute is just. We're going to implement this statute which allows Finwë to be remarried. But we get the last of the really cool pieces of text here. Mandos issues one of his great prophecies. He says, hearken now, O Valar. To me foretelling is granted no less than doom, and I will proclaim now to you things both near and far. Behold, Indus the fair shall be made glad and fruitful, who might else have been solitary. For not in death only hath the shadow entered into Aman with the coming of the children destined to suffer. There are other sorrows, even if they be less. Long she hath loved Finwë, in patience and without bitterness. Aule nameth Fëanor the greatest of the Eldar, and in potency that is true. But I say unto you that the children of Indus shall also be great, and the tale of Arda more glorious because of their coming. And from them shall spring things so fair that no tears shall dim their beauty, in whose being the Valar and the kindreds both of elves and of men that are to come shall all have part, and in whose deeds they shall rejoice. So that long hence, when all that here is, and seemeth yet fair and impregnable, shall none the less have faded and passed away, the light of Aman shall not wholly cease among the free peoples of Arda until the end. I love that.
Oh, he's
That may be Mando's longest passage ever.
Yeah. Well, he's squeezed the entire Middle-earth legendarium into one paragraph. One thing that I love about this is the children of Indus shall also be great. Mm-hmm. So again, good will come of Finwë remarrying,
and from them shall spring things so fair that no tears shall dim their beauty. Mm-hmm. Oh, that and even the sorrow will have been worth it.
Right.
That the sorrow will not change how beautiful these things are.
All the sorrow that we're going to see in the coming Silmarillion.
And we will see plenty.
And we will see plenty of unnumbered tears. But we're talking here about the children of Fingolfin and Finarfin.
Yeah.
We talked about some of those names last time.
Yeah.
There's in the first age, we're going to see what there's Fingolfin himself, there's Fingon, there's Turgon, in Finarfin's Idril, right? In Finarfin's house, we're going to see, of course, Finrod Felagund, wisest elf who ever lived, probably.
Yep.
We'll see Galadriel come from that house.
Yeah. And Gil-galad comes from Fingolfin's line, though not until later.
Right, Gil-galad comes from Fingolfin's line, and so he's the one at the last alliance of men and elves.
Help save men's behinds.
Yeah,
Idril, and this is the key really, though, is Idril, isn't it? I mean, Idril marries Tuor and bears Eärendil, and he has a major part to play. Right. And then, of course, his kids are Elrond and Elros.
Right.
From whom Arwen and Aragorn are descended. So
right, and we talked I think in the last episode, we talked about how there's all these half-elven that have basically kind of come down into one line, ultimately ending in well, not ending, but going down to Aragorn and Arwen, and that's where the story ends. But they continue on. But that's what goes back to this the last sentence here from Mandos. The light of Aman shall not wholly cease among the free peoples of Arda until the end. Now, remember, the light of Aman entered the peoples of Arda through Melian and Thingol in our last episode, which is actually the Sindar and, of course, Luthien Tinuviel. But remember, we talked about this, the lineage of how she sort of sires or mothers, foremothers that line. But it is...
For a word nerd, I'm surprised you actually even went with that word, sires. But anyway.
I fixed it. I changed it to foremothers. I couldn't think of the feminine form of that.
I know, I couldn't either, actually.
But it is through the children of Indus that a big chunk of that lineage comes from. And that is the reason why there is that light of Aman, that little bit of Maya blood that is in the free peoples of Arda until the end of Arda.
Yeah.
It will always be there. It will be very, very small as time goes on, but it will always be there.
And this is just another example of what we talked about Iluvatar turning bad to good.
Absolutely.
It's not bad necessarily that Finwë gets remarried, but it might have been better had he not in certain things, as we'll see. And yet, Iluvatar turns it to great beauty, as we'll see. And it'll take us the whole book to see that, but it's well worth it.
Yep.
So, I mean, seriously, big names in the children of Indus that are just absolutely key and central to the story as we go forward. So, well, anyway, in the end, the Valar consent. But Manwë tells Finwë, if Míriel thy wife will not return and releases you, your union is dissolved and you have leave to take another wife. So Mandos is the only one who can go talk to her. She's dead. So he goes and tracks her down. And she says something very interesting. I came hither to escape from the body, and I do not desire ever to return to it. This is kind of what Ulmo was talking about. This is, at this point, she's no longer making a decision out of the pain of childbirth or the burden that she had to bear. She's now making a willful choice to remain separate from her Roa. In a way, she's really violating her nature.
It is unnatural. Yeah,
it is. But we'll see later. Hint, spoiler hint. We'll see later her thoughts on this, but not for a few more chapters.
Right.
Wow. Okay, so now we come back to the actual book, don't we?
Yeah.
So we see
all
that she's
from
totally
one
different.
Of the Silmarillion.
So she's totally different from Míriel. She's tall. She's golden-haired. We find also in some of these other sources that she's not skilled of hand like Míriel is. Instead, she is a singer. And so her gifts are very different. And mirth follows her everywhere. She's happiness. So she's very different than Míriel. Kind of a trophy wife, if you will. Did I just call Indus a trophy wife? I did. She's tall and blonde and gorgeous, and she's a singer. She doesn't have any physical talent whatsoever. I'm kidding.
You kid Indus of the Vanyar.
Indus rocks. I mean, really.
She does.
So
her kids are some.
But not everybody thinks that Indus rocks, right?
No. Certainly her stepson doesn't.
Wow,
going back to the book, the wedding of his father was not pleasing to Fëanor, and he had no great love for Indus, nor for Fingolfin and Finarfin, her sons. He lived apart from them, exploring the land of Aman, or busying himself with the knowledge.
He lived apart from them.
Yeah?
He lived apart from them. Self-isolation?
Yeah, that's
I'm just spotting different things.
Another of the sins of Melkor. Yeah. I was just thinking, like, that's it, Dad. I'm moving out.
It is. It totally is. It's like spoiled. Yeah.
It really is.
It's her or me, man.
Right.
Come on, Dad.
If anyone who's been waiting for this book to get to some really human emotions and motivations, some flawed characters. We've been talking about, gods, capital G and little g. We've been talking about all these elf patriarchs who are so just so mythical.
Yeah.
Fëanor here, this is very human. There's his daddy issues, mommy issues. This is I don't like my new stepmom. I don't like my half brothers. I'm moving out.
Yeah. It really is.
And we know that Finwë gave so much of his love to Fëanor when he was young. So this is a spoiled child who's not getting his
chicken's coming home to roost, Finwë.
Yeah. He's got to share the house with two younger half brothers. He's not happy about it.
And by this point, one thinks that he's already, we don't know this, but it sure seems that he's already had his sons, hasn't he?
He's probably already moved out and married Nerdanel, and yeah. So
Was that another thunderstorm there? I heard another.
Yeah, it is.
Boom.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Maybe Fëanor is listening to this. He's
Fëanor.
He's got his.
Our podcast has massive reach. It gets even to the halls of Mandos.
Yeah, seeing stones, not hearing stones.
No, the seeing stones do not transmit audio.
Nope.
That would make our podcast really boring.
Yeah, it would. But it's just interesting because I talked about the fact that the Noldor are a bit more human than the other elf kindreds, and here Fëanor. These are very human characteristics. They're not admirable traits, but they are very human, and I think this might be part of why a lot of people feel Fëanor is very sympathetic. He is relatable in a way, and I think that's why some people tend to sympathize with him, and maybe that's why some people are a little bit more fond of him than the text suggests they ought to be. Tolkien, another thing, if I want to pull another thing in from one of Tolkien's letters, this is from letter 153. Elves are certain aspects of men and their talents and desires incarnated in my little world. Wow. So Fëanor is just some of these not so great human traits writ large.
Yeah,
really.
Writ large. That's a very good point. Wow. So we see, a lot of this is on Fëanor, of course, because we rightly blame him for things, but we also see now that a lot of this is Míriel's fault and Finwë's fault.
Yeah,
really.
If Finwë had endured his loss and been content with the fathering of his mighty son, The courses of Fëanor would have been otherwise, and great evil might have been prevented.
But at the same time, we wouldn't have had what we had with the
That
children
beauty
of
of
Indus.
Indus's children,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Wow. Well, I think we've actually touched on all of Fëanor there, and it's taken us quite a bit of time. But now we're going to get to talk about Melkor.
Melkor.
So
Yeah, I think. Well, all I want to say is, we talked about the ticking of the clock. The noontide is waning.
Yes.
And of course,
This is
Melkor
an
is being
alarm bell.
released. Yeah, Melkor is released right now in this chapter.
Yeah, why do we do this? I still don't know. So Fëanor is working hard. They are doing their job, and Indus's sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin, are growing up, so they're still young.
Mm-hmm.
The noontide is drawing to its close. So Melkor's completed his 3 ages of bondage. Why does that not sound right?
We'll leave that one there.
Yeah, we'll just not. I'm not going to touch that one. Dwelling for 3 ages in the duress of Mandos alone. Now, we don't know how much time that 3 ages is. So
It's long.
It is.
Very
It's obviously
long.
very long. So Melkor comes out and he looks upon the glory and bliss of the Valar and of the children, and envy was in his heart. So you want some sins? We got some sins. Envy was in his heart. He looked upon the children of Iluvatar that sat at the feet of the mighty, and hatred filled him. He looked upon the wealth of bright gems, and he lusted for them. But he hid his thoughts and postponed his vengeance. So now he throws himself on the mercy of the court, sues for pardon, saying, if only I can be the least of the free people, I would aid you all, and especially in the things to make right what I did wrong.
Mm-hmm. Sure you will.
I know. Why do I not believe him? Interesting. Nienna aided his prayer.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Nienna did aid his prayer.
Why is that? Now, compassion's right. That's kind of her deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pity, compassion. It really, to me, it shows us that there's a certain weakness, a blind spot in compassion.
I think,
pity,
I think a blind spot is a good way to put it. Nienna would certainly say that everyone deserves pity. Everyone deserves compassion.
True.
But as you say, there is a blind spot there because some people deserve it less than others.
There you go.
You know,
we're all equal. Some are more equal than others.
Right, exactly. Is that a George Orwell reference?
Yep.
Yeah.
Animal Farm.
Right. But yeah, and part of this is, the Valar they want to give Melkor a second chance, or I think we're up to a third chance by this point, aren't we?
Well, I wonder, is in Nienna's mind, and I just would love to ask her this, is this blind spot a known thing? In other words, is it a risk one assumes in exercising pity and compassion? Or is it something that somebody exercising pity and compassion isn't even aware of? That's just a question we can't even answer. I don't even know that we can try. I just think it's interesting. A wise person, as Nienna would be, I would think, would understand that there's always a risk. And therefore there is this known calculation. Hey, I may be wrong here, but I'm still going to have pity.
Well, and that reminds me of, there are actually a couple of things about this that remind me of Lord of the Rings. What you just said reminds me of, it's Gandalf's words to Frodo in chapter 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring, isn't it?
Yeah, Shadow of the Past?
Shadow of the Past.
Or is that 3? I don't remember now. 2
it's
or
2.
3?
3 is company once they're actually on the road.
You're right.
But it's, and I don't have the passage in front of me. I wasn't prepared for this, but it's where he's talking to Frodo. Frodo says it's a pity that Bilbo didn't kill Gollum when he had the chance, and Gandalf said it was pity that stayed his hand.
Yeah.
And I think he goes on to say something to the effect of, even the wise cannot see all ends.
Yeah. Some that deserve death, some that live deserve death, and others that die deserve life. Can you give it to them?
Right.
Not even the wise can see all ends. So no, Nienna may not be able to see all ends here, but she knows that it's a risk.
Right.
It's interesting because
but that also brings us back to, isn't there a faith in SPBMI there?
Yeah. Well, in this case, it would be a faith in Iluvatar, in Eru himself, that there's always the chance
that Melkor is still redeemable.
That Melkor is redeemable, exactly. Just like we see that maybe there's some good left in Gollum,
Right.
So Mandos is silent. Mandos knows all things save those that were still in the freedom of Iluvatar. My inclination is that he knew full well
absolutely
what was going on, and that Melkor was not being honest to this abasement.
He certainly knew.
Yeah.
But remember that he only speaks when Manwë bids.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Manwë did not bid.
In that context, he speaks as the judge, obviously.
Right.
But anyway, so Manwë grants him pardon, but it's more like probation. You can't go anywhere. This is like he's got the ankle bracelet on. He's got to see his probation officer.
You got the low jack. You can only stay within 100 yards of a Zelahar.
I'm pulling up my app on my iPhone called Find My Melkor.
Find my Melkor.
Oh man, nope. Sure enough, he's still in the gates of Valmar. Very good.
Yeah.
That didn't last long, because like a lot of evil, he's able to make himself seem not evil, and Valar and Eldar alike get profit from his aid and counsel, which is ironic because he would never seek counsel himself. So it's pretty funny. So eventually he gets off of his probation and is on full on release.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, it seemed to Manwë that the evil of Melkor was cured. For Manwë, and this is such an interesting thing because this isn't so much.
It is.
It's a reflection of naivete. I mean, it truly is. For Manwë was free from evil and could not comprehend it, and he knew that in the beginning, in the thought of Iluvatar, Melkor had been even as he, sort of a there but for the grace of God go I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah. I thought of exactly that.
Recognizes that I could have fallen too, so I
Right.
got to give pity to this guy. Which is, again, Frodo, same thing. Would I have been in his shoes? Had I been in his shoes, would I have fallen,
Right.
But Manwë did not perceive that all love had departed from him forever.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of falls into that same
Well, and remember
trap
that,
with Nienna,
these
doesn't he?
two are brothers,
Yeah,
the brothers in the mind of Iluvatar.
Twins,
And,
Coeval. They
Yeah, right.
same origin.
yeah. And I think you're right. I think there's, it's a sympathy, and it's, I love that there, but for the grace of God go I. That's exactly what I thought of with this.
Yeah, it really is. Oh. But, well, you had, I know I kind of touched on it with that's kind of what Frodo sees, but you actually had an actual quote from Two Towers, I think.
Yeah. From Two Towers, this is chapter 1 of book 4. There's a very, very relevant passage. So this is Frodo and Sam are still in Amon Muil. They've just met Gollum. And this is right when they're taming.
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
And
That's a good word to put it.
yeah, I think that's the name of the chapter, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So it says, for a moment it appeared to Sam that his master had grown, and Gollum had shrunk, a tall, stern shadow, a mighty lord who hid his brightness in gray cloud, and at his feet a little whining dog. Yet the two were in some way akin and not alien. They could reach one another's minds. Now, this struck me for so many reasons. First of all, the reference to Frodo as being like a mighty lord who hid his brightness in gray cloud. I mean, that sounds just like Manwë with the reference to cloud and the mighty lord. Little whining dog.
Melkor
I like to think of Melkor like that. But this idea that the two were in some way akin and not alien. And this goes right back to Melkor had been even as he.
Yeah.
And then this last bit about they could reach one another's minds. So we do see in Lord of the Rings that Frodo has a better understanding of what Gollum is going through for obvious reasons.
Right.
They both bore the ring.
But
however,
not a complete knowledge.
Not a complete knowledge, as we know how that story plays out. Frodo could not see to the depths of Gollum's heart any more than Manwë could see to Melkor's.
Wow. That's an excellent insight on that one.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good quote. I'm glad you pulled that one in. I'm almost reticent to keep moving, but I'm looking at our time and realizing we can finish this. We don't have to break this into two.
No, I think we
were really afraid we might have to. But Ulmo was not deceived, and Tulkas clenched his hands whenever he saw Melkor, his foe, go by.
You could just see him muttering under his breath, like, I'm going to strangle that guy.
For if Tulkas is slow to wrath, he is slow also to forget. Though something tells me Tulkas is just kind of slow. But
no avail as a counselor.
But and this, I love this line, and it's so important. but they obeyed the judgment of Manwë.
Mhm.
For those who will defend authority against rebellion must not themselves rebel. Let's chat about that.
That's really big.
It's telling. It really is. That's a philosophical statement, and he's making a statement without really backing it up, right? I mean, we're saying this has to be this way. If you're going to do A, you must not B. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, he's making a statement that doesn't have any other authority, but it's right. It makes sense.
It's certainly a logical statement.
Exactly. It's logical.
How can you denounce rebellion?
How can you justly defend authority against rebellion if you are yourself rebelling?
If you are yourself rebelling. And I think this is fascinating. We've talked a lot about rebellion, especially in the Ainulindalë.
Yep.
We talked about the fact that there are some who rebel in a good way, not defending authority, but like, for example, you see Ulmo.
Well, yeah, he's the one that comes to mind, and it's interesting that he's one mentioned here.
Right, and Ulmo does frequently rebel when it's in the best interest of the children of Ilúvatar.
Yeah.
We even saw that, letting the Teleri stay on Tolaresia for a little while in Chapter 5.
And catching some heat from the rest of the Valar
for it. But he doesn't rebel here.
No.
And, you expect Tulkas to follow orders. That's
he's a follower. Yeah.
But Ulmo is one of the Aratar. He's
the high ones of Arda. You're right.
Yeah, and he's very close to Manwë.
Mm-hmm.
I think Ulmo doesn't rebel here because he knows that Manwë is trying to give Melkor another chance. I think he doesn't like it and he doesn't want to, but he understands that there is a motive here, that we're giving Melkor another chance because we want to believe that he can be redeemed. And I don't think Ulmo believes he can be redeemed, but he's going to go along with it. And
because that's what Manwë has said.
Because that's what Manwë wants. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're right, because the rebellion that we see in Ulmo is always on behalf of the children.
Right.
Not only what we just talked about last chapter with Tolaresia, but what we see later in his involvement with
Tuor.
With Tuor. I'm like, yeah, with his involvement with Tuor, where he even, and we get this in Unfinished Tales, where he actually kind of talks about, that's my role. My role is as my role among the Valar is to be the one who does these things.
Right.
And he understands that to be his job from Ilúvatar.
Right.
So in other words, he's obeying a slightly higher authority than Manwë in doing what he's doing. So it is interesting. But anyway, great line. I love that. Of course, that's a philosophy that I can, fully get behind and subscribe. It's a challenge. Those who defend authority must not themselves rebel. If you're going to say that authority is key, it makes me think. You and I both used to play D&D. So if you're lawful,
right, exactly,
you can't change your alignment, man.
Right, you have to play to alignment.
If you're lawful good or even if you're lawful evil, whatever. If you're lawful,
you have to follow the rules of
chaotic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're following the rules that you believe.
It's your core. It's
and your DM will call you out in front of the rest of your friends on a Friday night if you don't.
You're going to start rolling a whole bunch of ones. Oh man, we have gotten in far too many geek references tonight.
There's no such thing as too many.
No, that's true. Well, so the next paragraph, we see that Melkor really not a big fan of the elves.
No.
But what do you take a little bit here and walk me through this?
Yeah, so now in his heart, Melkor most hated the Eldar, both because they were fair and joyful, and because in them he saw the reason for the arising of the Valar and his own downfall. Therefore, all the more did he feign love for them and seek their friendship.
He feigns a lot, doesn't he?
He does.
Earlier, he feigned even to himself, right?
Yeah, and he feigns to them because he hates them so much.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, methinks the Melkor doth protest too much. And he offered them the service of his lore and labor in any great deed they would do. I think there's a lot that I think is fascinating here. One of the things that always strikes me about this is he sees the Eldar as the reason for his downfall. Now, that's because of the arising of the Valar, and of course their job is to prepare Arda for the coming of the children and everything. So there is truth to that idea. But It's
Yeah.
really funny to me because, oh, they're the reason for my downfall. Like,
Really?
dude, you're the
You're the
reason
reason
there's
for-
evil in the world.
Yeah, exactly. You're the reason for the
You're
downfall
the-
of the world.
Right, exactly. And so you could certainly attribute this to Melkor's selfishness. Obviously, he doesn't
Yeah.
he doesn't think that
He
art
sees
is
things
marred.
through very, very narrow lens.
Very. He doesn't think of Arda being marred. He thinks of Arda being, Melkorized.
Melkorized.
And really he sees things only as either tools that help him achieve his ends or as obstacles.
Yeah, things. in his
And
way,
obviously
you're
right now the Eldar are obstacles.
but not for long. He starts to see the Noldor, doesn't he?
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
what's interesting is now we see the three different groups of the Eldar and how they respond to Melkor. We get the Vanyar. This comes
Love
back to
this.
that dog and cat, the pet analogy, right?
Absolutely.
The Vanyar dwell in the light of the trees and were content. So they held him in suspicion. Now, I didn't see the pet thing so much there. I was just thinking of the fact that they were content because contentedness is so important. And it's something that we see the Noldor not being.
Right.
And so I see it as, contentedness being good, and the Vanyar thus, because they are behaving in a way that is good, are, have a little bit more discernment here.
Well, and certainly, and the fact that they are content and they are not seeking for something means that they're less susceptible to temptation. No doubt about that.
Right.
The pet analogy is fun. I don't want to come down too hard on the Vanyar. It's good. They're happy. They're with the Valar. They're happy with the Valar. They love the light of the trees, and they're good.
How did you put it? We were talking about this earlier.
OMG Valar.
OMG Valar.
Yeah, I think with both the Vanyar and the Teleri, they're both just really happy with what they've got. The Vanyar are all, OMG Valar, and the Teleri are all OMG nature, OMG trees, OMG seas, I think is how I put it.
That's pretty funny stuff. But you're right. They are content with the way things are. They love nature and they love their boats, and that's about all they need.
Yeah.
Whereas the Vanyar, all they need are the Valar. But the Noldor, they need more, right?
They're not happy.
They're not content. They take
To enjoy
delight
it,
in
right.
the hidden knowledge that he can give them. They want to learn all the things that he can teach because they are striving for knowledge.
Yep.
They're always looking for that stuff. That's what we talked about. It makes them more human, but it also makes them more susceptible to temptation.
Right.
We see it all over the place in terms of the desire to craft, the desire to learn, and the desire to kind of maybe have more technology.
Yeah.
Not always a good thing.
Not at all.
In fact,
And we
not
see
often,
in
not
this-
ever a good thing.
Right. Well,
let
we
me
see
phrase that.
well, and we see here that some hearken to words that it would have been better for them never to have heard. We'll see a lot of that later on, but
Yes, we
it's that
will.
idea that by you're just hungry for knowledge, which is I personally believe that is a good thing. Being hungry for knowledge is a good thing, but some knowledge is good, some knowledge is bad, and you have to be discerning.
Well, and what you do with that knowledge is
Certainly what you do with that knowledge. Yep.
and how you pursue the knowledge. What will you give up for that knowledge?
Yeah.
At what
Well, and
price does that knowledge come?
Right, and there's an element of if knowledge from Melkor comes at no price, which it probably doesn't come at a visible price or an obvious price.
Right.
It's one of those, if it's too good, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
And that's it. It's the knowledge that you work for is probably going to be in all cases more valuable than the knowledge that is just handed to you.
Yeah.
But,
my goodness.
But not Fëanor. Fëanor
No.
was never susceptible to this, and
well, yeah, he had his own problems, but listening to Melkor was not one of them. And in all fairness, we've got to make that point. Melkor claimed that he had taught Fëanor, but he lied in his lust and his envy. For none of the Eldaliae ever hated Melkor more than Fëanor, son of Finwë, who first named him Morgoth.
Morgoth,
Dark enemy of the world. Ensnared though he was, he held no converse with him and took no counsel from him. Well, we know he took no counsel from him because he didn't take counsel from really anybody, right?
Right.
I mean, the text tells us here that he asked the aid and sought the counsel of none that dwelt in Aman, great or small. I'm sorry, you've got Manwë there, you've got Aule there. You're not asking for anything from them.
You got some smart cookies there.
Yeah, it'd save only
Maybe
and
not
for a little
Tolkien,
while.
but-
Yeah. He did ask, he did seek the counsel for a little while of his wife, Nerdinel. But that's it.
Because there was love there. We know that there was
There
love.
was great love, no doubt about that. But, I see he is driven by the fire of his own heart only. He's working ever swiftly and alone. Alone. So I'm seeing, we recap the sins of Melkor. We've got pride, a desire to dominate others, impatience, and self-isolation. Do we see all of those in Fëanor yet? I don't know that we've seen explicit pride yet, but we will. But we certainly see the desire to dominate others, the masterful and the desire to master others that we saw in comparison to Nerdanel. We see impatience in a number of times, including here, working ever swiftly, and self-isolation.
Absolutely.
So just,
And as you say, we certainly have seen the hints of pride. We haven't seen him actually do much.
No, we
in
will.
this chapter, but we will. We absolutely
it
will.
won't be very long before we do.
Right.
But one thing to his credit, he did name Melkor the right name. He calls him Morgoth.
Morgoth, the black enemy.
That name sticks, or the dark enemy of the world, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, anything else before we wrap this up? Because I think we're probably getting to that time.
I think that's it.
All righty.
Time to wrap.
That does wrap it up for this episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Thanks for joining us tonight, and really appreciate you listening to what we had to say, because there was a lot of it.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you'll join us next time when we get into Chapter 7 of the Silmarils and the Unrest of the Noldor.
As always, if you need cheap paperbacks to mark up, use the links on our library page at theprancingponypodcast.com.
And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to us on iTunes or Google Play Music. If you're an iTunes user, we would love it if you take a moment to write us a review. We're also on Stitcher and TuneIn. Yes, thank you. We are also on Stitcher and TuneIn. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, the Prancing Pony Podcast, so you can get current updates, listen to previous episodes, and interact directly with Alan and me. We're also on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod, so follow us and retweet us to your friends.
Please.
Thank you very much.
We really, it sounds horrible. We want a bigger audience, not because you're not enough, but because we want even more questions and feedback and all sorts of great discussions. We want to eventually start opening it up to, maybe even having an open phone call time where we can take a couple calls. But one last thing, we want to remind you, don't forget to send your questions, comments, or romantic advice for Dwarves in Love to maybe with people that are taller
not with
than
elves.
them. No, to the advice would differ greatly between advice for dwarves in love with elves than advice for dwarves in love with dwarves.
Yeah.
One is get a stool, the other is get a razor. To the Prancing Pony Podcast at gmail.com, and we'll try to get them into our next episode. Well, an hour and 50 minutes or something like that is still far too short a time to spend amongst such admirable listeners, but thank you for that time. And until the next time,
Farewell, friends.